A few months back, I met a woman at a local coffee morning who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had this incredibly earnest energy, eyes wide, voice slightly trembling as she recounted a relentless string of bad luck. She spoke of unreasonable landlords, treacherous friends who turned on her overnight, and bosses who fired her without cause. Listening to her, I felt that natural human pang of sympathy. I instinctively wanted to offer a kind word, maybe even step in to help. But as she detailed yet another betrayal, a tiny detail snagged in my mind. A specific date she mentioned didn't align with a story she'd told just minutes before. Then I noticed a micro-hesitation, a split second of cold calculation before she named her latest tormentor. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted. That slight inconsistency acted like a crack in a perfect mirror. I realized that the faint, unsettling hum beneath her polished victimhood wasn't anxiety, it was performance art. I wasn't speaking to a person in distress. I was being audited by a narrator who had meticulously crafted a story not for connection, but for control. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes the person claiming to be the victim is actually the one holding the weapon. That opening narrative, it really highlights the core insight we're tackling today, this unsettling recognition that victimhood can be, well, meticulously crafted, weaponized. We often think of manipulation as loud or obvious, but the most destructive forms are subtle. They're designed to trigger our deepest empathy and really to dismantle our reality from the inside out.
It is. It's the calculated nature of that performance that is so disturbing. And our mission in this deep dive is to move beyond just recognizing the behavior and instead look at the underlying mechanics. We really want to understand the why and the how behind these meticulously crafted narratives. We're focusing on how specific personality patterns can destabilize everything.
Everything.
From intimate relationships to structured workplaces and, as we'll see, all the way up to broad public health dynamics. We'll be drawing directly from research on what's called the dark triad, neurochemistry, and the specific tactical playbooks these individuals use. It's kind of a shortcut to understanding the blueprints of destruction.
That's a powerful mission, and if we want to understand those blueprints, we have to start with the foundational concept, the one that helps us categorize these consistent destructive patterns. Let's unpack the dark triad.
The dark triad, or DT, refers to three distinct but statistically overlapping personality traits. They really represent a darker core approach to social interaction. When these are highly expressed, they predict antagonistic behavior. The first is narcissism.
Right, the classic grandiosity.
Exactly. Narcissism is characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, often it's just in fantasy, but certainly in how they present themselves, and an excessive, almost desperate desire for admiration and validation.
Right.
They have an almost insatiable need to be perceived as superior.
So this is the one who prioritizes their self-image and status above everything else, and often there's this really fragile self-esteem just beneath the surface.
That's it. Then you have Machiavellianism. This is a purely calculated, pragmatic interpersonal style. It's marked by deep cynicism, strategic deception, and a highly exploitative view of other people.
So people are just pawns.
Exactly. The Machiavellian individual views people purely as tools or obstacles in their relentless pursuit of self-interest. They are the cold, clinical strategists.
The long game player. The master of the cooperative facade who is, secretly running the numbers on everyone around them.
And finally, the trait that is perhaps most strongly linked to the greatest societal risk, psychopathy. This involves a really striking lack of empathy, a glib, superficial charm, severe recklessness.
The charm is a big part of it.
It's a huge part of it. And also a complete remorselessness and a high degree of what's called disinhibition, a lack of internal constraint, which leads to antisociality. Psychopathy is often broken down into three related components: boldness, meanness, and disinhibition.
Okay, so we have the self-aggrandizing narcissist, the calculated and cynical Machiavellian, and the callous, unempathic psychopath. If these traits predict toxic behavior in one-on-one relationships, how do they scale up? I mean, how do they manifest when we zoom out to behavior on a societal or even a public health scale?
And this is where the research becomes incredibly instructive. We reviewed a surprising study linking these dark traits to adherence to public health measures during a contagious respiratory disease pandemic. It was a perfect, real-world case study on how individual differences impact the willingness to honor the social contract.
So when public authorities appealed for universal cooperation, social distancing, hygiene, protecting others, who stepped up and who dug in their heels?
Researchers use standard personality models, including the five-factor model, or FFM, which describes normal range personality, alongside the dark triad, to predict adherence. And the results for pro-social traits, they really validated our assumptions.
These are the people you want on your team during a crisis.
Exactly. The pro-social FFM traits, specifically agreeableness, which covers empathy, cooperativeness, and warmth and conscientiousness, relating to responsibility, organization, and risk-avoiding behavior, they consistently predicted a high endorsement of health behaviors. These are the individuals whose intrinsic nature aligns with the collective good. They adhere to norms not out of fear, but out of a recognition of mutual vulnerability.
Okay, so that's the adaptive functional side of society. Where do the dark traits factor in? And I mean, how steep is the drop-off?
It's a profound inverse relationship. The dark traits collectively predicted a low endorsement of those same protective health behaviors. But here is the critical distinction, the finding that truly underscores the danger. The dark traits, specifically the facets of psychopathy, particularly meanness, which is callous exploitation, and disinhibition, impulsive recklessness, and lack of constraint, predicted the intent to knowingly expose others to risk.
Wait, let's pause right there because that's a massive leap. We're not talking about benign negligence or, just forgetting something. We're talking about expressing a willingness to deliberately endanger other people if they thought they were a carrier.
That is the crucial, chilling finding that separates antagonism from mere apathy. Participants scoring high on these specific psychopathic facets were asked to rate the likelihood of specific behaviors if they suspected they carried the disease. And high scores on meanness and disinhibition correlated directly with endorsing behaviors that actively put others at risk of infection.
Like what? What kind of behaviors?
Things like attending a large gathering without mentioning symptoms or maintaining risky close contact with others.
So if we contrast the meanness and disinhibition components, meanness is the lack of care, the callous exploitation, the I don't care who I hurt, and disinhibition is the impulsivity, the recklessness, the I'm going to do what I want regardless of the rules, and they both converge on social risk.
Precisely. Meanness provides the motivation, that zero-sum game mentality, and disinhibition provides the lack of regulatory control needed to execute the dangerous behavior. This is why personality isn't just a psychological curiosity. It is a fundamental societal variable directly relevant to epidemiology. If a small but antagonistic subset of the population is predisposed to disregard collective safety measures, it creates a systemic vulnerability that puts everyone else at risk.
That moves the issue from just being uncooperative to genuinely antagonistic behavior. It forces us to acknowledge that personal boundaries, or the lack of them, have public consequences.
And this antagonism was demonstrated even further when researchers tested different public health messages, or PHMs. They wanted to see what kind of appeal resonated with people.
And what did the general population respond best to? What worked?
Overall, the vast majority of participants preferred the compassionate message. It was generally phrased around altruism, something like, help protect the vulnerable members of our community.
Which makes perfect sense, right? Our society is built primarily on pro-social instincts.
Absolutely. Agreeableness and conscientiousness strongly predicted the appeal of that compassionate message. However, here's the key divergence. The maladaptive traits, meanness, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, they negatively predicted the compassionate message's appeal.
So not only were they less likely to adhere to the measures in the first place, but the very message designed to encourage adherence was ineffective for them.
It suggests something even deeper than just indifference. When you appeal to someone's sense of duty toward others, and that person scores highly on callousness and exploitation on meanness, that appeal might actually trigger a hostile response.
A hostile response.
Instead of simply ignoring it, they may view it with contempt. The message of helping the vulnerable can be interpreted by the antagonist as a weakness, an attempt to enforce a rule based on sentimentality, which they fundamentally reject.
So appeals to altruism may not just fail, they might actively backfire in antagonistic individuals by triggering defiance or contempt. That has profound implications for crisis communication. You can't use a single universal message if a segment of the population is wired to reject compassion.
Exactly. It necessitates nuanced communication strategies that focus on, say, self-interest or mandated authority, rather than shared humanity when you're addressing that small but dangerous minority. The stark takeaway from this research is that dark personality traits pose a quantifiable societal risk by promoting risk to others.
That finding that dark personality traits are a measurable factor in public safety, it leads us neatly into contained environments, specifically the calculated sabotage we see in organizations. This is where the charismatic persona meets structural risk.
The transition is seamless because the tactics are identical, only the target shifts. We need to look at the organizational risk posed by what we can call the charismatic saboteur.
And the case of Elias, the department head, gives us a perfect template for this dynamic. He wasn't overtly incompetent. In fact, he was hitting high key performance indicators. He had the charisma, the decisiveness. He was the perceived star employee. Yet he was quietly dismantling the organization's human capital to secure his own position.
And he did it through the most insidious method, the smear campaign, disguised as genuine care. The Force described him taking a junior employee out for coffee and dropping a casual, seemingly empathetic bomb. I'm really worried about Sarah's mental health, or she seems erratic lately. I hope she's getting help.
It's the perfect covert weapon. He didn't submit a formal HR complaint. He didn't engage in an open conflict where he could be held accountable for the facts. He used a whisper campaign. He was planting seeds of doubt, using triangulation involving a third party to manage the perception, to systematically isolate and discredit rivals like Sarah, who was a highly competent project manager.
The manipulation is that he cloaked hostility and compassion. By expressing concern, he shielded himself from any accusation of malicious intent while achieving maximum destructive effect.
And the people he told.
The people hearing the whispers, feeling they're being trusted with sensitive information, they become his unwitting agents, spreading the narrative of Sarah's instability.
And what were the consequences for the organization in the end?
They were catastrophic. Sarah, the target, resigned, citing an unmanageable hostile work environment. That led to a massive legal settlement for the company. The subsequent internal investigation realized Elias wasn't just targeting Sarah, he had destabilized 3 separate high-performing teams to eliminate perceived threats and ensure his own standing remained unchallenged.
But wait, if Elias was hitting high KPIs, if he was generating revenue, why should the company care about his soft methods? I mean, isn't results what matters in the short term?
That is the fundamental mistake organizations make. They fall prey to the narcissistic leader's superficial success. The core insight is that focusing only on high numbers and structural liability Elias created. He wasn't stabilizing the business. He was setting up a ticking time bomb.
He traded short-term gains for long-term structural integrity.
Precisely. They lost highly competent talent, incurred massive legal costs, and damaged their internal reputation. All because they failed to recognize that manipulative behavior is a systemic risk that needs to be audited just as rigorously as profit margins.
So let's do a deep dive into the broader DT arsenal in the workplace. How do these traits translate into specific influence tactics used on colleagues and subordinates?
Research strongly correlates the DT traits with the adoption of numerous tactics of influence, which are often categorized into hard and soft styles. This allows us to predict the likely approach based on the trait profile.
Okay, start with the hard tactics. I'm assuming this is where Machiavellianism and psychopathy dominate.
Absolutely. Hard tactics involve overt aggression, threats, coercion, and a forceful, non-negotiable style of interpersonal influence. These are primarily correlated with psychopathy, the drive for dominance and lack of fear of confrontation, and Machiavellianism, which views force as a highly efficient tool when others are no longer useful.
So bullying.
They are more likely to resort to blatant bullying or overt pressure.
Yes. And the soft tactics, the charm offensive.
Soft tactics leverage compliments, flattery, ingratiation, or feigned compassion to achieve a goal. These are strongly correlated with Machiavellianism because they are highly effective tools for goal attainment, and especially with narcissism. The narcissistic leader excels at impression management. Their superficial charm is their primary currency, used to win over superiors and potential allies.
It's a dual approach then. They charm upwards and coerce downwards. This explains the quick rise of toxic leaders.
It does. The research on leadership effectiveness confirms that DT exhibiting leaders may experience success in the short term, particularly in ambiguous, rapidly changing, or chaotic environments. Their perceived confidence, their grandiosity, and their higher tolerance for risk are initially mistaken for vision and decisiveness.
But the long-term detriment you mentioned must be immense. What are the specific organizational diseases caused by DT leadership?
They are devastatingly consistent. Narcissistic leadership is heavily associated with corporate financial misreporting, tax evasion, and prioritizing spectacular risky ventures over stable growth. They need the spotlight, even if that spotlight is attached to a catastrophe.
And the psychopathic leader, what does that look like?
That trait is linked to pervasive abuse of supervision practices and significantly elevated employee turnover rates. They create environments of intense psychological distress, characterized by cruelty, emotional exhaustion, and burnout, because they systematically undermine employees' basic psychological needs for autonomy and relatedness. They are controlling, unfair, and utterly indifferent to the human cost.
So Machiavellianism cultivates the toxic, distrustful environment where everyone is just looking out for themselves.
Precisely. They prioritize personal gains over collective organizational goals, leading to systemic distrust, backstabbing, and a dramatic decline in creativity and collaboration. The common thread is the systematic erosion of psychological safety, which is a necessary precursor for any successful adaptive team.
Given this enormous financial and structural risk, what are the concrete organizational interventions suggested to deal with these pervasive saboteurs?
Mitigation has to be systemic. It has to be focused on auditing character, not just metrics. First, refine leader selection. This means integrating validated personality assessments and structured interviews specifically designed to probe for these dark triad traits, moving beyond relying purely on charisma or self-reported achievement.
You're testing for character before competency.
And then, once leaders are in place, establish robust accountability systems and promote radical transparency. This deters unethical practices by making it impossible to run effective whisper campaigns or engage in secretive financial dealings. Leadership development has to shift focus to emphasize genuine ethical decision-making and emotional intelligence, counteracting the DT tendencies by reinforcing the ethical framework of the organization as a whole.
Let's move from that overt sabotage to a topic that often slips completely beneath the radar: passive-aggressive behavior. This is covert hostility in motion.
Passive-aggressive behavior is a deliberate yet indirect expression of anger, resistance, or resentment, and it's a massive drain on productivity and morale. The PA employee often feels underappreciated or unfairly treated, and since overt aggression is typically punished, they deploy sabotage within the scope of their control. Their priority is expressing their covert hostility, often at the expense of professional competence.
How does this actually manifest in practical terms in the office?
It's a calculated inefficiency. They exhibit avoidance behaviors, consistently missing deadlines, often with plausible but hollow excuses, avoiding responsibility by claiming overwork, or the classic move of withholding crucial information or forgetting to share important documents.
The forgetting.
Yes. They also rely heavily on written communication notes or email to avoid face-to-face contact, thus limiting the risk of immediate confrontation.
And just like the broader manipulation we discussed, they use victimhood when they're confronted.
They personalize confrontations from authority, instantly adopting the victim role. They feign cooperation and dedication, often promising the world, but their consistent output is failure or delay. When questioned, they use plausible justifications, a sick relative, the stress of moving to mask their deliberate resistance.
Managers must hate dealing with this because it requires confrontation against someone who's playing the victim.
That is precisely what the PA employee is banking on. They know managers are conditioned to avoid unpleasant consequences and maintain a facade of niceness. However, the research suggests that when you assertively confront a PA employee, they typically won't fight back directly. They may withdraw, clam up, or engage in emotional outbursts like crying, but they rarely stand their ground in an open conflict. That's a key weakness to exploit.
Okay, so what are the effective managerial countermeasures against this systematic covert hostility?
You have to shift the focus entirely from promises to provable actions and stringent accountability. First, always parcel out important tasks among several people to dilute the risk of single-point failure. Second, establish frequent check-in points and dictate the time schedule yourself, ensuring the PA employee cannot control the pace of work. You must focus rigorously on what the individual does rather than what they say they will do.
And assertively address the veiled hostility, forcing them to own the negativity.
Exactly. Don't let the sarcastic comments or veiled digs slide, or you implicitly endorse them. You need to address the intent directly and assertively. A manager should use phrases that require them to clarify their meaning. Did you intend to be sarcastic just now? I perceive sarcasm as an indication that you have an unresolved issue you wish to discuss. Or, was that comment meant as a dig at the team? If so, let's address it now. This forces them out of the comfortable territory of indirect communication.
We've covered the individual, the organization, and the subtle tactics within. Let's broaden the scope one last time to look at the community. the invisible contagion, where unchecked personality traits become a public health issue that infects social settings.
This is a critical move because it demonstrates the scaling effect. When the same isolation and smear tactics used in the workplace are deployed in an intimate social setting, the damage is amplified because there are fewer external accountability structures than in a corporation.
And the story of Margaret, the HOA leader, illustrates how this control dynamic works in a tight-knit neighborhood.
Margaret was ostensibly a community pillar, organizing events and leading the HOA, but she used this position to enforce absolute control through classic us versus them dynamics. If someone questioned her, they didn't get a debate. They got labeled dangerous, selfish, or immoral, and were systematically quarantined from community support.
Like the young mother who was suddenly excluded from essential functions like carpools and neighborhood alerts.
The isolation was targeted and complete. It led to severe anxiety and depression in the target, requiring medical intervention. The goal of this behavior isn't just to win an argument, it's to destroy the target's social and psychological support system. Margaret weaponized the community itself, turning neighbors into unwitting participants in her personal dramas against her target.
And the ultimate consequence of that is the destruction of psychological safety for everyone in that community. If one person can be excluded and destroyed based on one powerful individual's subjective narrative, then everyone lives in fear of becoming the next target. It poisons the well.
It creates a climate of hypervigilance and silent compliance. People choose to remain silent to avoid being quarantined themselves. The remedy here is sociological, a form of immunization program, public awareness or community workshops that train people to recognize these specific manipulative patterns early, empowering them to support the vulnerable and maintain community safety, rather than aligning with the aggressor.
It's about training the social body to resist the contagion of fear and manipulation. This leads us to the most profound form of damage these tactics cause, the trauma bond, and the disturbing neurobiology that anchors victims to toxic partners.
This is the section that truly requires us to set aside moral judgment and embrace biological reality. It explains why victims of calculated, intimate manipulation find it almost impossible to leave, even when their logical mind is screaming danger.
Let's look at the patient, Chloe, and her relationship with Julian, the master of love bombing, followed by disappearance and neglect. She was going through physical withdrawal after leaving him.
Chloe's experience is the perfect illustration of a trauma bond built entirely on intermittent reinforcement. This is a concept from behavioral psychology B.F. Skinner, where the desired reward, validation, affection, safety, is delivered only occasionally and unpredictably.
The classic slot machine analogy.
It's the perfect and terrifying analogy. Chloe was continuously pulling the lever, reaching out, trying to communicate, hoping for the return of the good Julian, because she knew that eventually she would hit that jackpot.
That rush.
The intense rush of the honeymoon phase, the profound apology, the moment of connection. Unpredictable rewards are exponentially more addictive and harder to extinguish than predictable ones. The brain is conditioned to crave those tiny scraps of kindness mixed in with devastating neglect.
So we need to detail the neurochemical storm that chemically chains the victim to the toxic partner. What is the main driver of this intense craving and pursuit?
That is unequivocally dopamine. Dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter of craving, seeking, and motivation, not necessarily pleasure itself. It releases strongly during the intense idealization and love bombing phase. But crucially, it also responds dramatically to unpredictable rewards and intense emotional events. In this way, the unpredictability of the abuser, the roller coaster, is actually linking the user to the brain's deepest survival and reward circuits, similar to highly addictive substances.
So the brain registers the intense drama and unpredictability as something vital, something it needs to survive, rather than something dangerous to escape.
Exactly. The brain is always trying to optimize for reward. Since studies show dopamine flows more readily when rewards are given on an unpredictable schedule, Julian's random sweet gestures, apologies, or brief moments of tenderness right before another incident of abuse don't deter the victim. They cement the addiction link. The contrast between pain and relief is what creates the addiction.
And what about oxytocin, the attachment hormone? We usually associate that with comfort and safety, not trauma.
Oxytocin is the love hormone that promotes attachment, trust, and reduces stress when it's released in positive social contexts. It releases strongly during love bombing, creating that initial powerful connection. However, in the context of trauma bonding, oxytocin delivers what we call a double punch. It is highly sensitive to context.
How does this hormone actively push the victim back toward the toxic source?
When the victim is under intense stress, say during the abuse or when trying to leave, oxytocin levels can rise dramatically not to calm them, but as a response to social distress. The brain is signaling a desperate need for connection and social soothing. Because the abuser is the most emotionally salient and charged presence in their life, the brain defaults to seeking connection and reunification with the toxic source.
Wow. So the very mechanism designed for secure attachment is corrupted into promoting insecure, traumatizing attachment.
It creates a biological imperative. When the victim attempts to leave, they don't just experience the stress of separation. They experience a stress response and an intense social separation anxiety driven by oxytocin, physically pushing them back toward the abuser for perceived safety. You also have endogenous opioids contributing to feelings of pleasure and dependence. When the bond is severed, these opioids drop, causing genuine physical and psychological withdrawal, making leaving feel like an unbearable drug detox.
And we can't forget the stress hormones involved in this traumatic roller coaster.
No, we're talking about cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine. Cortisol is perpetually released during the dramatic highs and lows of the abuse cycle. Adrenaline, released during moments of fear and anxiety as part of the fight-or-flight response, paradoxically triggers additional dopamine release. This is how victims become adrenaline junkies, addicted to the very drama and the rush of unpredictability that is destroying them. They are chemically bound to the chaos.
This neurological storm explains why leaving is not a logical failure, but a battle against a biological addiction. Which brings us to the psychological cage that justifies the continuation of the bond. Cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance is the intense mental distress caused by holding two completely opposing beliefs about the abuser simultaneously. Look at the example of Caitlin and Marcus. Marcus has a history of cheating, rage, and profound gaslighting. But he also has these occasional breathtaking moments of tenderness and charm.
So Caitlin holds two mutually exclusive beliefs. Belief A, he is toxic, cruel, and dangerous. Belief B, he is a good man at his core who didn't mean to hurt me.
And that internal conflict is psychologically agonizing and unsustainable. To end the distress, the brain must resolve the dissonance, and it does so through rationalization and self-deception. Caitlin chooses belief B, the one that minimizes immediate pain and upholds the bond. She rationalizes his infidelity by deciding, perhaps, that she pushed him away, or rationalizes his rage as a protective wall, or a response to his own pain, even though he offers no sincere apology.
She convinces herself the relationship is fundamentally sound, and the immediate relief she gets is a form of self-regulation.
It is a profound, albeit maladaptive, self-calming mechanism. The brain engages in this cognitive reappraisal, choosing the narrative that minimizes immediate pain and validates the high-stakes investment she has already made. She sacrifices long-term safety for immediate psychological relief, effectively sentencing herself to more future pain to resolve the current dissonance.
So, if victims are chemically chained and psychologically caged, how do they begin to heal these trauma bonds and break the cycle?
The primary non-negotiable step is no contact. This is critical because it prevents the brain from releasing attachment chemistry, the intermittent dopamine hits, and calming oxytocin in response to the partner's behavior. If the slot machine is completely removed, the craving cycle eventually begins to diminish, allowing the withdrawal process to commence and eventually conclude.
And since the abuser so often isolates the victim, genuine social connection must be the replacement therapy.
Absolutely. The crucial role of genuine, compassionate social support cannot be overstated. When victims are surrounded by safe, trustworthy people, the brain begins to function optimally. This kind of connection facilitates the release of calming oxytocin, the kind that soothes anxiety and promotes secure attachment, reducing the craving for the toxic bond. Reestablishing safe connections directly counters the isolation tactic the abuser deployed.
And retraining the reward system to find joy and safety, not in chaos.
Yes. Building healthier, predictable sources of dopamine is vital. This means engaging in exercise, hobbies, creative pursuits, and nurturing friendships. This helps retrain the brain's reward system away from the addictive, unpredictable rush of the abuse cycle and towards stable, safe, and positive experiences. It's a fundamental rewiring project.
The neurological explanation removes the stigma and restores agency, clarifying that this is a biological fight, not a moral failing.
It shifts the entire dialogue.
Now we transition to the specific, often shocking tactics these manipulators deploy to isolate their targets and maintain absolute control, the arsenal of deception. And we have to start with pathological lying, which is described as a non-negotiable hallmark behavior.
Pathological lying is pervasive, not episodic. It is used constantly to maintain power, dominance, and advantage. The goal is simple: to stay one or two steps ahead of the target's reality so they can always be positioned for control or exploitation.
And the deceit is layered, moving from obvious fabrications to something far more insidious.
Correct. You have the blatant fabrications and the exaggeration of their own positive qualities, claiming integrity or competency they simply don't possess. But the most destructive form is the lie by omission, or the truth that is drip-fed. They withhold essential context, leaving the target with a nagging, unsettling sense that something crucial is missing from the story. This fosters chronic confusion and makes the target doubt their own memory of events.
And we saw particularly harrowing examples of how they weaponize vulnerability by fabricating illness.
This is calculated control, masquerading as fragility. We saw the example of the narcissistic mother who would claim debilitating migraines, always at the exact moment a difficult conversation or demand for accountability arose to stonewall the interaction. Even more alarming was the case involving Stephanie's father, who allegedly faked hyperacusis, an extreme sensitivity to noise.
Using that fake vulnerability to actively control and harm other people.
He used it as a tool of environmental control, claiming that mundane, necessary noises like someone closing a filing cabinet or a colleague talking nearby were causing him excruciating pain. This allowed him to submit malicious complaints about innocent people, leading to those individuals facing disciplinary action or even getting fired. They weaponized the natural empathy we have for the sick.
That requires a complete systemic lack of conscience. The suggested countermeasure moving from blind trust to an observer stance seems vital here.
It means becoming a meticulous documentary expert in your own life. You have to stop relying on faith and instead meticulously note discrepancies, document communications, and assume that every story needs external verification.
Pathological lying perfectly sets the stage for false promises and financial sabotage. The betrayal here is often devastating because it targets the target's tangible future security.
False promises are designed to play directly into the target's hopes and dreams, often promises of shared success, joint finances, or stability, without any genuine intent to follow through. The promise itself is the first layer of the betrayal.
And the examples are just heartbreaking because they target foundational security.
We heard the story of Jill's partner promising to pay half the mortgage and expenses, encouraging her to take on more debt based on that promise, and then simply disappearing when the bills were due, leaving her financially ruined. Another partner maintained secretive financial arrangements, claiming they were for tax reasons or to protect you from risk, when they were actually set up for later exploitation, ensuring the manipulator maintained full access and control over the joint resources.
This shocking betrayal involving forging documents demonstrated the ultimate level of calculated deception.
This was a case where a partner requested the car title, claiming it was for an insurance update or some other benign administrative task. Then they forged the victim's name to transfer ownership of the car to themselves. To complete the sabotage, they subsequently called the police on the victim, claiming she stole the car. It was calculated, layered deception designed to destroy the target's financial and personal freedom simultaneously.
That is criminal intent built on layered trust and deceit. The countermeasure here must be severe early caution. Avoiding shared financial commitments until consistent, observed trustworthiness is proven over a lengthy period.
You cannot build a financial future with someone whose integrity you have not observed under stress. The stakes are simply too high.
Next, the most widely discussed form of psychological assault, gaslighting. The insidious erosion of reality.
Gaslighting is psychological manipulation designed to make the victim question their own thoughts, memory, and sanity, creating profound confusion and dependence on the abuser for a definition of reality. The manipulator maintains power by being the sole arbiter of what really happened.
What are the primary mechanisms used to achieve this cognitive breakdown?
They systematically deny clear events. That never happened, or you're imagining things. They shift blame instantly, twisting the target's valid feelings into evidence of the target's own instability. They use, "I was just joking," to dismiss truly cruel actions, making the victim feel overly sensitive or hysterical. And critically, we see the rise of the good guy gaslighter who uses false compassion. "I'm worried about you, maybe you need more sleep," to disguise their cruel actions, framing their malice as concern for the victim's well-being.
Survivor Annie described how her partner could twist facts so intensely during arguments that she would completely lose track of her original point, feeling utterly lost and crazy.
And the impact is devastating. Constant confusion, intense anxiety, loss of self-confidence, and a complete dismantling of self-esteem. It can lead to what was described as professional paralysis, where a target starts doubting their own competencies and decisions in their career because their confidence has been so fundamentally dismantled at home. They lose the ability to trust their own assessment of any situation.
So, to combat this internal erosion, the countermeasures have to be both external and internal.
Externally, documentation is non-negotiable. Rigorously journaling events, saving all communications, and seeking the perspective of a trusted, unbiased third party, like a trauma-informed professional, to reality check the situation. Internally, and this is the most difficult but vital step, the victim must learn to turn inwards for validation and trust their own instincts. They have to stop seeking reality checks from the gaslighter and rely only on their own documented reality.
Finally, we loop back to our opening anecdote, the dark twist where the manipulator actively presents themselves as the victim. Victim playing. This is the exploitation of empathy itself.
This tactic directly weaponizes our inherent human empathy. The manipulator shares twisted stories of suffering, betrayal, and relentless bad luck to gain trust, framing themselves as a helpless target of external cruelty. This is fundamentally a strategic empathy audit.
An audit of the target's soft spots.
They're gathering data, they're learning the target's core values, their triggers for sympathy, and their ethical boundaries. Once they know what makes the target vulnerable, say a strong belief in supporting the weak, they use the victim narrative strategically later to gain compliance and avoid all accountability.
And this creates that devastating psychological bind we called the kicking a kitten problem.
Precisely. If you attempt to set a necessary boundary, say demanding they repay money or holding them accountable for their behavior, it feels morally reprehensible because you feel like you're actively hurting a genuinely vulnerable person. This immense psychological difficulty forces the target to comply, just to alleviate their own internal dissonance and perceived cruelty.
And this tactic exploits broader societal norms, making the manipulator almost immune to criticism.
It weaponizes our societal reluctance to victim blame. By presenting themselves as the ultimate sufferer, constantly misunderstood and betrayed by the world, they leverage our general discomfort with criticizing anyone perceived as vulnerable. This cloak of perpetual victimhood grants them near total immunity from criticism, accountability, and boundaries, turning the target's own sense of fairness and empathy against them.
This deep dive has been comprehensive. We started with the unsettling recognition of the performance of victimhood, moved through the pervasive societal risk posed by dark personality traits in large groups, dissected the devastating neurological addiction created by trauma bonds, and finally cataloged the specific arsenal of calculated deceptions, from smear campaigns and gaslighting to financial sabotage and victim playing.
What we've demonstrated is that what often feels like inexplicable chaos, pervasive bad luck, or repeated failures in intimate relationships or work may actually be the result of meticulously crafted patterns of sabotage and control. These are hidden beneath a convincing facade, be it of charisma or constant suffering.
And the knowledge that these patterns exist and that they are predictable and mechanistic is the foundation of resilience.
The most vital takeaway is the necessity of cultivating that internal resilience learning to discern who to trust based on consistent actions and observed patterns over time, rather than initial feelings or highly polished, convincing stories. It is about trusting your gut feelings, because those instincts are often the first alarm system, picking up on the micro-hesitation or slight inconsistency long before the conscious mind connects all the dots. Use that awareness as a catalyst to solidify self-trust and self-protection.